Hello everyone and welcome to Cinderful Gaming. I hope you're all doing well, I hope you're all staying safe, and most of all, I hope you're all fighting that war against the grey. Today's video, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of starting with Warhammer Age of Sigmar, in particular with each of the death armies within the game. We did our video talking about the best and worst armies to start with in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and something we've been asked to do is look at all the other armies in the same sort of light. So giving our views on every Warhammer Age of Sigmar and how we can start them, and what are the pros and cons for starting each one of those factions. And so today we're going to look at that in all the different death armies in their totality, and look at how easy it is and maybe how not easy it is to get in with all of these armies. With that said, first of all, we're going to look at a set of criteria that we use to determine whether or not an army is easy or not to get into for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. This is our own personal opinion. These are things I look for when telling people and when showing people how to get into the game. Alright, and so here is our criteria. So, first of all, an army we think is easy to get into, first of all, if it has a Star Collecting Box or similar point of entry. This could be something like a starter set or even a access to it through, the starter set for another game, whether it's coming in another box set or it's got a dual box set coming out. This definitely increases the value of an army. Now, of course, dual box sets and battle forces for Christmas aren't always available, but if these are available, this obviously can change how, I guess, you can feel about this question. If we answer no, but obviously if something comes out that changes this, you can maybe change this point to be a yes if there is an easy point of entry. For example, at the moment, we do know that both oceanic Bone Reapers and the Soulblight Gravelords have battle forces, so at the moment, they're good to get into with those battle forces, but they are only limited time models. Model count for the army is not massive. Now, this is certainly a struggle within Death as a faction, though it is not impossible to play more elite Death armies, and we will talk about that in the video. Model count is important. You don't want to have a horde of 200 models you have to paint for your very first army. It can make the task really, really daunting. And not only that, going into our next point, it can make the cost quite excessive, especially if you don't have something like a Star Collecting Box. A lot of these points will intertwine and continue to be the same sort of things, but it is important that you try to only get one of these points or two of these points as a negative and have most of them as a positive for you. Painting skills is another one that is important as well. Continuing on with the model count, having too many models itself is painting skill requirement because you don't want to have to paint through that many models. Also, highly detailed miniatures can be more difficult to get through for your first starting army. If the first models you're painting in Warhammer are the most highly detailed miniatures you can find, it's going to take you a lot longer and you're going to have more struggles as you're going to have to learn skills and stuff you might not otherwise with an easier to paint army. We also want the army to be able to play in multiple ways, so you can use your collection of miniatures more than one way. This is incredibly important. So you want to be able to, first of all, use your miniatures in just swapping them in, say, a sub-faction to allow you to play in a different way. But you also want to be able to play with particular miniatures in your army and expand your collection to play with different miniatures within the list to allow you to spread your wings. And of course, the last thing is, while not everyone cares about being competitive, it is worth noting how competitive an army is, because some armies definitely are down the bottom and some armies definitely are up the top. This is really important, because if your friends will play with really top tier competitive armies that are right up the top of it, and you pick an army up that's down below, you need to at least know what to expect with that army in terms of competitiveness, because it may be, I guess, a little bit of a sour taste. If you pick this up, you don't understand, and all of a sudden you cannot win games against your friend just because your army isn't as good. But that is our criteria, so let's get cracking into the death armies for today. And so, first of all, we have the Flesh Eater Courts. Now, for starters, they have an amazing Star Collecting Box. In fact, I think it is one of the probably two best Star Collecting Boxes out there in the entirety of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. It gives you your big monster, which has a variety of different options to build, whether that be variations of your character or unmounted versions, which is great. And also gives you both your baseline infantry in ghouls and gives you some of your elite infantry, a box which actually builds all of them as well. What's great about this is it gives you the units you need to summon and all of that, and we'll talk about the fact this army has summoning in the future in a bit, but it's a fantastic Star Collecting Box, one of the best in the game, and really does help getting started with this army and has multiple purchase ability. Obviously, this helps as well, because while this army does have summoning, it has a relatively low model count for a death army. Yes, you can have hordes of ghouls in an army, but there are also builds of this army that focus around having just monsters in your army list. This means the cost of your army will drop down as well, because you can also just keep buying the same star collecting box over and over. Picking up, say, 3 or 4 of that star collecting box can really hit you with a decent cost for an army and really lower that cost, and also get you a full army that's not only good on the tabletop but has not many models to paint, because even if you picked up 4, you would have 4 monsters, like 12 of the more elite troops and 40 troops. You would still have around the 60 model mark, which is, you know, a decent size but not massive for an army. The lack of summoning isn't there with this army. It does have summoning. Most death armies do have summoning of some sort. And this one has actual summoning, so it's bringing new units to the table that weren't in your original army list. But like I said, with the cost of like those all monster armies, your summoning is probably not going to be all that much. Because you can limit the amount of models with your initial army to all monsters, you can really not have to have that struggle with summoning, because it's not that extra many models and it's not really upping your number. You can have a 60, like have to paint 60 models, but that could be including all of your summoning anyway. Painting skills for the army is relatively easy. You've got large patches of skin that do well with some really dirty textures on them to represent the diseased and deranged ghouls, and also your giant monsters are for the most part bone and sinew, which means they take contrast colors really easily and can come up really nicely with really basic techniques of painting. Multiple ways of play is certainly something you do have with the army, though the range of models is limited, so you don't necessarily expand into more models, you expand into playing different styles of those models. So you can play that all monster list, you can play heavy with ghouls, you can have flying monstrous infantry, heavy armies, and even a mix in between as well. So that's sort of where you play with this army. You're not getting more different models, you're playing with the same models in different ways. Ease of play with this army, well, the all-monster army literally is charge forward and murder stuff, and so that makes the army really easy to play in that fashion. But this does lead to a competitive issue with the army. Yes, there are certain times where if this army rolls hot and goes through and steamrolls someone, it'll absolutely start murdering everything in its way, and there's not much that can stand up to a Ghoul King on Terrorgeist fully buffed. However, the army does lack that sort of nuance that some other armies have in the competitive play, because they are sort of a one-trick pony, and sometimes they can lack the ability, so it does take a skilled general to use more advanced, I guess, playing techniques and knowledge that might not be there with initial play. Next up, Nighthorn. So Nighthorn do not have a start collecting box at the moment. If you can find one of the old Malignant boxes, that's an okay start, but does include some non-sold by Nighthorn models, so you're going to have issues with that. Also, the army was featured in the previous edition of the Warhammer Age of Sigmar starter set, so if you can find a Soul Wars box somewhere, it may be a decent point, but at the current point in time, there is no star collecting box or a way of ease of entry into this faction, so that is a point against it. Model count for this army also is incredibly high, so that is another point of entry against it, though the cost of the army, some of the troops in this army can be rather expensive, though there are ways you can find some cheaper troops, particularly through eBay and second-hand sellers, thanks to the old starter box and also things like the Mortal Realm magazine, making some of your troops definitely cheaper than what they are from a direct Games Workshop store. Lack of summoning for this army is definitely something again going for it. It does have a really high model count to begin with, unlike some other death armies, but like many death armies, it doesn't have true summoning. It much rather brings back the troops that have died rather than actually adding more troops to your table. So this means while you are bringing back models and you're putting extra models on the table, they're just models that were there before. So if you have a unit of say 30 Chain Rasp Horde, you're never going to have more than 30, but you definitely can keep bringing them back and topping them back up to 30. Painting skills for the army is one that's really good. Nighthorn are really easy to paint. They've got large areas of cloth and bone, and both of these colours just take really well to contrast paints and other technical paints, or even basic things like dry brushing or washing, and very basic painting techniques. What's great about Nighthorn as well is because they are such an easy army to paint with nice and deep textures, that actually can take some really more advanced painting techniques really well as well. So you've got the ability to really sort of evolve your painting skills along with the army. You can start off really basic and add extra techniques and stuff to things like the flames throughout the army and learn new things and really advance your painting with this army as well. The army honestly does not have very many ways to play at the moment. It does have a very limited set of competitive builds, and while I guess you can build different styles of lists, the ones that are actually going to be effective on the tabletop at the moment are quite limited. This does lead to a lack of ease of play with Nighthorn. They don't really play like many armies do in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. They rely on either rolling particular numbers on their charge rolls to attack in the charge phase and ignore certain things that are, I guess, negatives for them in the addition, and they also don't play around with things like all-out defense either, thanks to their ability to not have save ability modifiers. This does leave Nighthorn in an interesting sort of place. They do have their issues, but they certainly aren't the worst army to get into. They've got a lot of models you need, and their ability and competitiveness on the table isn't that great, and they're probably the biggest two strikes against them. However, ease of painting and the ability that while you have an initial high model count, you're not bringing any extra models into the army with summoning is, I guess, some bonuses for them. And the cost of the army certainly will come down if you can find some of those older kits, things like Soul Wars and the old starter sets, and things from Mortal Realms to really help you sort of lower that cost of the initial entry point of the army. Next, we have the Oceanic Bone Reapers. So, once again, we don't have a star collecting box for this army, though at the current point in time, there is a Battle Force box. If you can find it, that is a fantastic entry point for the army. We've got a video for starting with the army on that on the channel. This, I guess, is a point against them, the fact they don't have a star collecting box. However, model count for the army is somewhere in the middle. They're definitely not the most haughty one if you go for like a more mixed arm style force. And the cost of the army isn't terrible, as you do get 20 Mortec Guard, which are decent amounts of your points costs for a decent price. You pick them up for around 90 Australian. That comparatively to like other units that are coming out around them is not terrible. Definitely compared to like some of the Order armies like Witch Elves and Volkite Berserkers and stuff like that, you're getting a decent amount of models for a decent cost here. So that does lower the cost of the army. Model count, as said, is somewhere in the middle of the range. You're definitely not the, I guess, you are relying on ranks of your Mortec Guard, though you can go with an all cavalry army to definitely lower that model count for your army as well. You do not have true summoning within the army, much like the Nighthorn that we talked about before. This army relies on actually bringing back your troops that have died rather than adding new troops to your army. So you're never going to have brand new units arise on the table, but you are going to have your models coming back. So this means you're not having to buy extra models for summoning, and you are not having to paint extra models for your summoning as well. The painting skills required for this army are a mixed bag. There are definitely some easy parts of these armies to do, and there are also some more difficult parts of the army, as they do have a lot of fine detail work on things like armor trim and stuff like that. Though with some things like contrast and stuff like that, you can definitely avoid these and use some more basic techniques to start off your army and learn the more advanced techniques required to paint things like the banners and the trim and all the characters on the army later down the line. So you can start off using some basic techniques, but definitely there are some parts where you're going to want to learn some more advanced techniques and some more advanced brush control and stuff like that to paint them in the best possible way. Multiple ways to play is something that Bone Reapers do have. They are a little bit limited in the multiple ways to play, but you definitely can play with an all cavalry army and a more mixed arms army, and definitely a horde army of lots of troops as well. All these lists do work on the tabletop and are all quite effective. Ease of play with the army is an issue, though. This is probably the biggest thing against Bone Reapers, as they have their own mechanic called Relentless Discipline, which completely replaces the core mechanics of command points. While it works somewhat like them, it is generated differently, and it works differently on how it affects units, and each unit has their own unique sort of Relentless Discipline command abilities that they can use. So this does lead to the army being a little bit more complex to play in those certain instances. While you are following some of the basic rules of the game, you are ignoring, a very key component in command abilities and how that works, and changing it up for how you work with the army is certainly an issue. Competitiveness for the army is in a little bit of a middling spot. It's not really the worst army, it's not really the best army in the game. It definitely has the power to do really well with some good play, and it can also get away from you if you're not ready to sort of move around and learn the sort of movement style game, because the army can be relatively slow at times. So Bone Reapers are sort of that middling faction. They're definitely not bad, but they're definitely not the greatest. They've got some points for and against them in the game. And so, Soul Black Gravelords is the last of our death armies to talk about today. First of all, we have a star collecting box for the faction, though it does come with some units and definitely isn't the greatest star collecting box available. You get some White Kings, some Skeletons, and some Black Knights, all of which have very different usefulness on the tabletop in competitive sense at the moment, but you do have access to getting some cheap troops here at the start of the box. The cool thing about the army though is that it does have very different styles of play, so this means you can play with very different levels of model count within your force. You can have this horde of skeleton warriors, which made by the Star Collecting Box is definitely an easier way to get into that style army, but definitely I think one of the better ways to get in is either play with the Avangori dynasty playing over a monster heavy army, or playing with either Castella dynasty or the Legion of Blood playing a Blood Knight heavy army to make a vampire cavalry army as an easy way of point of entry. The cost of the army will definitely change depending on what list you go around with. Even if you're trying to build the Horde army and using the Star Collecting Box, it can get a little expensive to play with the army. With the Blood Knights and the heavy infantry and your monsters with the army, they're not overly expensive. You don't have any egregious sort of price points of entry for many of your kits within the army compared to some other forces. So this does mean that you can change around how you want to play your army and get into it in easier ways than others, changing up the model count, changing up the cost of entry as well, depending on how much you can spend and how many models you want to paint. Once again, like the other death armies we've talked about previously, the army doesn't have any true summoning. It does have a little bit in, say, the Vrikos dynasty, which is playing around with summoning some wolves to the table, but that is very, very minimal. Generally, like the others, this is going to be bringing models back to your units rather than actually bringing new units to the table. So your initial sort of starting painting size isn't going to get any bigger thanks to the units you're bringing back to the table rather than actual true summoning. Painting skills required for the army do vary. Things like Blood Knights, definitely while one of the more elite army builds, do require more paint skill. Same with the Avangori dynasty, having to learn to paint the monsters and all of that sort of stuff can be a little bit more difficult, though zombie, dragons and terrorghasts do go together really easily with very simple paint techniques. Things like the skeleton warriors and zombies though definitely take basic painting techniques really, really easy, and this does lower the painting skill. Depending on which army you play with, you can really sort of balance out that painting skill required. Easy to play, the army does play exactly how you think. If you're playing Blood Knights, it wants you to go charge, and if you're playing Hordes of Undead, it wants you to hold on to objectives for as long as possible. The army does play in a myriad of different ways, and this allows you to sort of chop and change. Like we've already talked about, you can start with a Blood Knight army and totally move into a Horde of Undead, and then even play with like a wolf heavy army as well, with all these weird vampire wolf creatures, and even play with an Aranguran dynasty to play an all monster army as well. So you've got a lot of ways to play. Not only can you change how your models play in different sub-factions, you can play with entirely different sets of models within this army to make an entirely different army. Competitiveness, this is a solid competitive army at the current time and point. It's definitely not one of the very top armies, but it is right up there in that sort of middling pack, probably one of the ones reaching towards being one of those top armies. With that said, it's a fantastic army to get into, and honestly, I think this is probably the best army to get into death with, just for the fact that it completes more boxes than any other army in the force. Well, that's the end of the video. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And while you're at it, drop us a comment below in the comment section and let us know what you enjoyed about the video. If you'd like to come chat more with me and other members of our fine little community here at Cinderful Gaming, you can do so by following the link in the video's description to our Discord server. Lastly, we'd like to give a shout out to everyone who supports the channel via Patreon and YouTube members, and you can go help support the channel via Patreon and YouTube members as well and get access to, if you're a YouTube member, some of our awesome little gifts, or get choice of what we're going to do for content on the channel. You can follow those links in the description of the video to Patreon and YouTube members. But a shout out to them all, our Patreons: Christian Weir, James Soren, Greenskins Gaming, AJC, Kenny Lyle, Outer and Shot First, Andrew Bowen, Nathan Fee, The Rising Ape, Pure Dynamic, Agu, Anthony B, Anton Nielsen, JJ Austrian, Average Wargamer, Domir, Mark Harvey, and James Cater. And to our YouTube members as well, a special shout out to Green Roots Gaming, Kenton Young, Chris Wallace, Aronya, Vinny, Locklaric, The Johnny84, David Ellsworth, Revenar, Wolfric Nick, and Broken Chef. Lastly, I'd like to give a special shout out first of all to Lady Witchvox Art, who does all the amazing artwork for the channel that you see here, and to Xmorphic, who does all the amazing work and the background work for our Discord server. Thank you both very much for all your help. That's it for today though, everyone. Stay safe, stay well, and most of all, keep fighting that war against the Grey. Ciao for now.